Good morning, and welcome to the 2021 J.I. Kislak Symposium. And thank you for your patience as we were attending to some technical issues. I see more people are streaming in. This is great. My name is Sean Quimby. I'm the Associate University Librarian for Special Collections with Penn Libraries and Director of the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. The theme of our conference this year is the ethics of collecting in the 21st century. I think it goes without saying that this isn't the first attempt to reflect on the subject in this still young century. It's not even the first attempt to do so this week at Penn. Just yesterday, and I hope many of you had a chance to attend this, our colleagues at the Penn Museum's Cultural Heritage Center hosted a powerful talk by Patty Gerstenblith on imperialism, colonialism, repatriation, and the Universal Museum. What I hope sets this symposium apart from others is that it reflects on an attempt to reconsider key ethical questions in the wake of so much upheaval across the globe these past few years. The pandemic, resurgent nationalism, religious extremism, a racial reckoning in the United States following the killing of George Floyd, the critical reappraisal of monuments, and the events of January 6th, to name just a few examples. But it also engages with these questions against the backdrop of creative new directions in post-custodial collecting, community archives, repatriation, and the restitution of cultural heritage. The underlying question that informs our proceedings then is, how equipped are our existing codes of ethics and policies to meet today's challenges, and how can we begin to chart a path forward? Today's symposium is co-sponsored by Penn's Wolf Humanities Center, whose programmatic theme this year, migration, is in many ways opposite to our focus today, which focuses on talking about the movement of materials, if not people. It's also sponsored by Penn Museum's Cultural Heritage Center. It's been conceived collectively by the Kislak Center's curators, especially Nick Herman, Samantha Hill, Arthur Kieron, Regan Kladstrup, and John Pollock, who put their heads together and considered from a wide variety of perspectives the ethical issues that impact their own day-to-day work and that of our colleagues in libraries, archives, and museums. I'd like to thank them for coordinating 4 excellent panels today, as well as last night's provocative keynote address by Erin Thompson, the art crime prof, who joined us from Nepal at 4 o'clock in the morning, where she is celebrating the repatriation of a work of art. And finally, I'd like to thank Lynn Farrington, Kislak's Director of Programs and Senior Curator, for her efforts to pull this symposium and our entire fall program together in the face of so much pandemic-related uncertainty. And of course, none of this would be possible without our Assistant Director of Operations, Eric Dillalog, and our colleagues in libraries IT, especially Betsy Deming. Before I transition to our first panel this morning, I'll run through today's agenda. We'll begin in just a few seconds by thinking about the state of acquisitions work. Then we'll move to a discussion of the repatriation of cultural heritage at 11 a.m., metadata and description at 1:45, and then finally wrap things up at 3:30 with a panel that focuses on post-custodial and post-colonial collecting. Okay, now I'll pivot to our first panel. We'll go ahead and get started. How have our cultural heritage collections taken shape over time? To whom do they belong, both legally and morally speaking? How can we construct a shared ethical framework for accepting donations and making purchases? At the center of all of these questions are people, the people who create, the people who acquire, the people who sell or donate, and finally, the people who stand to benefit from having access to them. Or to borrow from yesterday's talk by Dr. Gerstenblith, the people who enjoy, quote, the human right to access culture. Our panel this morning will include 2 colleagues from the museum world and 1 rare book and manuscript dealer. First, we'll hear from Anne Brancati, Senior Registrar at the Penn Museum. She coordinates acquisitions and deaccessions, as well as loans, security, insurance, and more. A product of George Washington University's graduate program in museum studies, she also serves on the emergency subcommittee of the Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists. Next, we'll hear from Arthur Fournier. Of the eponymous Arthur Fournier Fine and Rare, he is an independent dealer of books, serials, manuscripts, and archives in all fields and genres, specializing in primary source materials related to transformative cultural movements of the late 20th century, modern conflicts, disruptive technologies, music, performance, and the visual arts. He is a member of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America and focuses his practice in the trade on serving the needs of libraries and research institutions. Our third panelist today will be Derek Gillman, distinguished teaching professor, art history and museum leadership, and executive director for university collections and exhibitions at Drexel University. He's the author of The Idea of Cultural Heritage, Cambridge University Press, 2010, and numerous articles on the subjects of art and cultural heritage. From 2006 to 2014, he was the executive director and president of the Barnes Foundation, where he helped to steward the collection to its new home on the Ben Franklin Parkway. This brief introduction only scratches the surface of his many professional accomplishments, and I encourage you to read his full profile on Drexel's website. So each of our panelists will talk for about 10 minutes, and then when they've finished, we'll dedicate the rest of our time to some questions and answers. So I encourage our audience to engage in a robust and hearty discussion. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Anne, and we'll kick things off. Welcome, Anne.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sean, for the introduction. I am going to share my screen. Okay. So let's just jump right into it. I'm Anne Brancati. I am the Senior Registrar at the Penn Museum. I'm very happy to be with you all today and talk about acquisitions. So one thing sort of as we talk about acquisitions today to think about is the different roles that people play for institutions that have a registrar. The registrar is going to sort of typically act as the hub for coordinating kind of overarching collections related projects and policies, sort of acting as the record keeper for collections. So something like acquisitions tends to kind of fit pretty well within the realm of the registrar's office and is often coordinated by a registrar. The Penn Museum itself was founded in 1887, so it has a very long active history of collecting. The registrar's office wasn't founded until 1929, so as you can imagine, there was a lot of collecting happening even before the registrars sort of came onto the scene. But the very early archaeological collection at the Penn Museum was acquired through excavations, primarily through excavations. This was a time of really active collecting when the museum was seeking out material to add to the collection. So I've included a couple of examples here of some of the excavations, some of the early excavations. Definitely not an exhaustive list by any means, but just to kind of give you a good sense. Nippur, in fact, was the very first excavation, and it was what prompted the founding of the museum. The university participated in this excavation and realized, oh, we need an institution to house this material that we're bringing back. And then in the same vein, the early ethnographic collection was acquired through something that we call expeditions. So for example, we've got William Henry Furness here on the left. He was someone who went to Borneo on behalf of the museum in the late 1890s and collected material to bring back to the museum. Obviously, you can see that he was very interested in tattooing. So he collected tattooing implements that then became part of the Oceanian collection. And then on the right, you see Louis Shotridge. He was a curator in the American section for about 20 years in the early 1900s. He was Tlingit, and he went and traveled to Alaska on behalf of the Penn Museum and collected material that is now in the American section. So I want to kind of juxtapose those early excavations and expeditions with acquisitions today. Again, that was a time of very active collecting. And today, I would say about 95% of our acquisitions are donation-based. So it's really more of a time of what we would call passive collecting. Pictured here are objects that we've acquired over the last handful of years, all of them via donation. We're going to talk a little bit more about the red and tan bag that's kind of on the left center there. But one thing to kind of keep in mind is that as we transition into this donation-based acquisition, it really introduces kind of a new aspect of ethics to collecting, because now the museum is removed, at least one layer, sometimes more than one layer, removed from the original acquisition of an object. It may be that a donor acquired the object themselves, but it might have been someone prior to the donor. It might have changed many hands over the course of its lifetime before being offered to the museum. And so that really puts the onus on us as museum professionals to do a lot of research and to work with donors to kind of piece together the history of these objects to make sure that we've got a really clear picture of what's coming into the collection. And I think every institution probably has their own sort of review process in place when they're considering bringing objects into the collection. And I think in most cases, the first question everybody's kind of asking themselves is, does this object meet our legal and ethical standards? And I think those standards may vary a little bit from institution to institution, depending on, you know, the type of material that your institution is collecting. But I think it's really important to have written policies and procedures in place related to acquisitions. That way you have something to really kind of back up all of the decisions that you're making. And at the Penn Museum, in addition to having the curatorial section and the conservation department and the registrar's office review every potential donation, we also have an acquisitions committee. This meets biannually, and its focus is to do a real formal review of any potential objects that are coming into the collection, followed by a final review by the director. So, you know, we try to have checks and balances in place. And I think that's kind of an important thing to think about with acquisitions, making sure lots of eyes are seeing these potential donations or acquisitions, so that many people can kind of weigh in on the process. And then when we think about legality and ethics, the Pennsylvania Declaration, the UNESCO Convention, these are kind of the two touchstones for the Penn Museum, certainly, but I think for a lot of institutions as well. Both went into effect in 1970. And really the goal here is to prohibit illicit import, export, and transfer of cultural property. And that's why it's so important to really be working with donors to piece together the full history of an object before it comes into the collection. So a big part of that is obviously kind of clarifying the provenience and the provenance for every object. And of course, when we're talking about provenience, we mean the exact location or find spot for an artifact. And when we talk about provenance, we mean the chain of custody for an object. Ideally, you have all of this information for the object So I'm sort of circling back to this Jane bag because it's a really good example of a lot of robust information. Not only do we know who made the object, when it was made, where it was made, but we know all of the owners over the course of the object's lifespan. The person who donated it to the museum took photographs at the time that he purchased it from the maker. He had photographs of the maker. He wrote an article about it that was published. So it really was sort of accompanied by a lot of robust information, which is sort of the best thing that we can hope for. But I just kind of want to leave with this final thought that I'm hoping that we can sort of unpack a bit more in the Q&A. And that is, what is our responsibility as stewards of cultural property when objects being offered to us for acquisition actually don't meet our legal and ethical standards? I think about the objects that we decline to bring into the collection a lot. I think about what is happening to those objects and sort of where does our obligation end? So I think that's something a lot of us are thinking about, and hopefully we can sort of talk through it a little bit more. So that's everything from me. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back over to Sean to introduce our next panelists.
Hi there, thank you, Anne. That was wonderful. We will pivot now to the world of rare book and manuscript dealing, and my colleague and friend Arthur Fournier will speak for a few moments. Over to you, Arthur.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Arthur Fournier. I'm a member of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, and I've been a rare bookseller for about 13 years. As Sean mentioned in the intro, most of my work happens directly with libraries, and I'm in the service of humanities scholarship primarily. I regularly attend the meetings of the Rare Book and Manuscript section of the ALA, the Art Libraries Society of North America, and the Middle East Librarians Association. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here with you today at the Kislak Symposium. Thanks again to our organizers, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak as a member of the book trade about ethics in collecting, because there are a lot of questions, I think, about the history of the trade, how it's been practiced, and what we can do to make economic activities around the transfer of cultural heritage materials more transparent and more ethical. So while the subject fields and areas of my focus are various, all of my activities are centered on the placement of primary source collections and archives with research institutions. So whether I'm working with contemporary artist books, collections, or serials from Central Asia and the Middle East, in essence, what I feel that I'm trying to do is locate things that shouldn't get lost and bring them to the attention of people and institutions who generally don't lose things, especially those who are good at caring for fragile cultural heritage materials and making them discoverable and accessible. So I do this work speculatively as the sole proprietor of an independent small business. Working collaboratively with peers and institutions, I can handle logistics and negotiate frameworks sometimes that might be challenging for library professionals or museum staff to take on with their already overburdened workflows. And it's important for me to acknowledge that this is an extremely privileged and unusual niche role, which I am grateful to have established gainful employment. I try to practice it as transparently as possible with an acknowledgement of its contradictions and its limits. And this is what I always come back to. Capitalism, especially entrepreneurial speculative enterprise, is a very poor tool for the delicate work of cultural preservation. And I think we're all asking these questions right now, but I'm particularly interested in this question about how can book selling in the service of librarianship reform and improve itself. And at the essence of this, and I think this was really is a reflection of the wonderful talk that we heard last night, and also Anne's remarks just previous, that in our collections and in the transactions that sustain our research and exhibition practices, we must decenter the narrative of largely white Western nations as the only capable stewards of world heritage. So that's the baseline. It can't be this extractive colonial process whereby we tell ourselves that this is somehow a service to world heritage, and that there is only one form of stewardship. So there's this historical form of the book trade, which I think at best could be called treasure hunting. I've heard people use that term about what they like about what we do in the trade side. And at its very worst, this is nothing less than extractive grifting across lines of unequal power and access to knowledge about markets. So the question is, are there ways to practice a trade in rare books and cultural heritage documents which is not colonial, not extractive, and not dependent on unequal information or access to markets? And the answer here, I believe, is yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this. In my business, I try to center this more on service and not on speculation. So, if I'm able to collapse supply chains and connect repositories with potential contributors to the cultural record, and we adhere to strict boundaries and norms concerning questions of provenance and clear right to title that sellers must possess before transferring goods to institutions, I think maybe we can help do some of that work, as opposed to obscuring, origins which might be unsavory and might be illegal. So trade, I believe, when practiced ethically, can build bridges between human beings and people who are curious about one another. But this only happens when all parties to a transaction acknowledge one another's full humanity, making sure that contributors are seen, respected, included, and consulted at every step. So I think Sean Quimby asked me to come here today to talk about a case study related to some work that I've done in about a decade ago in Afghanistan. It started in 2012 when a staff member of the Turquoise Mountain Foundation in Kabul contacted me about an important collection of serials concerning Afghan history. And these were modern serials, most of them made between the late 1950s and 2001. And so they're all print multiples, which were published and sold publicly or distributed publicly in some fashion. So we have the presumption that there isn't just one copy of this in Afghanistan, but in some cases, perhaps thousands of copies of these documents. So that was an important first frame for me, that this would all be print material. And I understood this picture because it was a local bookseller in Kabul who had mentioned to cultural heritage workers at Turquoise Mountain that he wished to sell certain duplicates from his collection to a Western library. And his idea was that basically he could make some money doing this, but also that it would be important for there to be copies of these documents outside of Afghanistan. So with help from translators, I forged a professional connection to explore this idea. And we had conversations for several months via Skype. And I arranged to visit Kabul in early 2013. And this was a time when Afghanistan was more stable than it is these days, obviously, and more stable than it had been for much of the era, the occupation era. I'm going to start sharing screen now and just show some images of this trip, and I'm going to be very careful to not actually show pictures of the booksellers with whom I work, because right now, as we know, the picture has changed radically. So the book trade in Afghanistan. Oops, let's see. I thought we had another slide here. Oh, okay. In any case, wait, let me try that again. Okay, there is a robust book trade in Kabul, and one of the fascinating things about Kabul as a city and Afghanistan as a country is its position along the Silk Road. So this has been a place of cultural exchange and trade for centuries. And it was extraordinary for me to have the opportunity to visit and get to know some of my peers and colleagues in the book trade in Kabul. And while I was there, pardon me one second, While I was there, I was able to work with local booksellers to assemble a collection of materials, which included approximately 30 complete run serials related to the current conflicts and conflicts with the Soviet Union. Much of these were print magazines that were probably funded with money from the United States government, including the Central Intelligence Agency. But most of them were not represented in North American collections. So we knew that this would be of interest, and we wanted to do a responsible job of collecting them, sourcing them, describing them, and transporting them out of the country, just as transparently as we possibly could. So, for that purpose, I worked directly with export documents, using FedEx at the Bagram Air Force Base at the time, and we transported approximately 147 kilos of this material back to the United States, where we cataloged it with the help of Afghan refugees in Boston at F.A. Burnett Books, which was my employer at the time. This collection became the basis, was eventually sold to an institution, which was Stanford's Hoover Institution, and it became the basis of what is now called the Afghan Partisan Serials Collection. And it is one of the most important touchstones of contemporary Afghan political history for scholars in mostly Western countries. It includes languages, Pashto, Dari, Uzbek, and other regional languages, and it includes a tremendous amount of graphic art related to representations of the conflict from Afghan points of view. So through this chain of interaction, my colleague, my major counterpart in Kabul, was with us every step of the way, advising and in conversation, not only with curators, but also with expressing curiosity about the trade in this kind of information. And eventually, this resulted in additional business connections for these people, this individual who, again, I'm not identifying because of current circumstances, that allowed Eastview, a library supplier based in Minnesota, to develop a scanned repository of these serials, which we acquired and brought to the US, and other serials in their possession, which remained in Kabul. And this is used worldwide as a platform for research into modern Afghan cultural and political history. So it was an ongoing relationship that developed for 10 years. And all right, try to scan forward here. And I'm going to leave us here, at least with the documentation of some of the material from that collection, with images from the front and back cover of Afghanistan magazine, which was published by Zahir Shah royalists in 1994 to 2001 in Peshawar in Pakistan, to cast some, shed light on what was happening under the Taliban and the destruction of cultural heritage sites, including the Buddhist of Bamyan, which you can see depicted on the front cover and the rear cover of Afghanistan magazine, which is also, it addresses itself to a Western audience through the inclusion of translations of titles and some of the masthead information, even though the contents are largely in Pashto. So I'm going to probably end my screen sharing here, because I just wanted to give us a taste of what that endeavor looked like. And all right, and share, and then maybe go back to my remarks. But so the whole point for me was that this was not an endeavor that, if I was going to engage in a project like this, it wasn't going to be an endeavor where we go in, we try to obscure what we're going to do with this, we try to negotiate the lowest possible price, and then we leave, and then somehow myself and my colleagues in the trade in Boston would take full credit for this. We wanted to bring our partners into the conversation and continue a relationship with them which respects their expertise. So obviously, this picture has changed radically. So in August of this year, some of the individuals in Afghanistan with whom I work contacted me to say that they were extremely frightened about what was going to happen after the announced troop withdrawal that Biden had announced, and started asking, would there be a way for us to help them find safe passage to another country? I was hoping, that by the time, Sean and I spoke in September about this, and I was hoping that by December, we would have already found a pathway out of Afghanistan for our colleagues in the book trade who've been so vitally important to this establishment of this landmark in Afghan studies and in American research institutions. But we haven't yet succeeded. But what I can say is that, there is a group of colleagues, including individuals from the Penn Museum, who are working diligently every day and every week to, find this pathway out of Afghanistan. And so, what I want to say is not just about the ethics of collecting objects. I want to say that if we really believe in this relational frame where we, acknowledge and acknowledge the full humanity of everyone in this kind of transactional pathway from the publication of these items in Afghanistan and in Pakistan to their emplacement in a frame of research and scholarship in a Western institution, that we also have a moral and ethical responsibility to help vendors negotiate political consequences that they face in their home country when turmoil arises and political change happens. So we are responsible, and we need to do our collaborative best, from my point of view in the private sector and public sector workers to help, manipulate the levers of power and ensure that no harm befalls our partners in the field, especially when that harm might be a direct consequence of work performed for the benefit of scholars and students in wealthy Western nations. So I think these ethics can be applied broadly in the United States, of course, as well, across lines of class, of color, of power in multiple different ways. And I think that this is something we need to discuss openly about how we approach these relationships and how we take ethical responsibility, particularly when there is a power dynamic and we do have access to certain pathways to get things done that other people do not have. Scholars at Risk is an incredible organization, and I just wanted to acknowledge the work that Jane Unruh at Harvard University and Scholars at Risk has done as part of this endeavor to work with our counterparts in Afghanistan. And I hope that that very shortly there'll be information that can be shared publicly about the success of our endeavors to bring some of our colleagues from the book trade in Afghanistan to the United States, and that those individuals will join us in the continued activities of scholarship and librarianship around the cultural heritage documents, which they've helped us gain access to. So that's what I'd like to say today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur. That was fascinating. We will hear from our third panelist, Derek Gillman from Drexel University next. And I am going to run through Derek's PowerPoint. So he's going to tell me when to advance the slide. But with that, why don't we welcome Derek to the virtual podium. Over to you, Derek.
Thanks, Sean. So I felt privileged to hear the remarks already made covering the ethical issues. I spent part of my life working on East Asia, so I sort of share more with Arthur in a sense than might be given away by what I'm going to talk about this morning, which is actually here in Philadelphia. So let me use this as an introduction to some issues. And I want to talk about the Atwater Kent collection, which was housed in the Philadelphia History Museum, formerly the Atwater Kent Museum. It's actually, I mean, it seems to be very appropriate. Today is actually would be Atwater Kent's 148th birthday. So this is a collection which many of you who are from Philadelphia present today will know a little about, if not a lot about. It's a collection which is very large. It's 130,000 items, and it was housed in a building which was built for the Franklin Institute by John Haviland. And in 1938, it became the Philadelphia History Museum through a donation by Atwater Kent, who wanted to create a history museum for the city, which is entirely appropriate. Philadelphia, indeed, has such an extraordinarily rich, long-standing history. And the museum closed its doors in 2018. And so what's been happening since is that the city of Philadelphia, which owns the collection, has been working with Drexel University to transfer ownership of the collection from the city to Drexel through a petition to Philadelphia Orphans Court, which is now being heard in the Orphans Court as of this month. So I just want to introduce some of the objects in the collection very, very briefly, and then say a few words that may be, I hope, relevant to the panel discussion that follows. So if you could, Atwater Kent was an inventor of radios. I think it's pretty obvious from this slide. If I show on the next slide, please. So it has objects, about 11,000 of which were given by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, including these two. And so, as Lynn said at the beginning of the conference yesterday, the acknowledgement that we are in Philadelphia on Lenape land, there's the famous wampum belt, which is on display at the moment at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in their New American Galleries. It's on loan from the trustees of the museum and the city of Philadelphia, pending Orphans Court decision. And it's always traditionally been regarded as having been given to William Penn by the Lenape, and that's questionable. It may be 18th century, but it's an important object. It has great resonance, I think, for the history of Philadelphia and for the Lenape. And on the right is one of two celebrated portraits of Lenape chief Slepenosa here, who was absolutely appalled by the walking treaty that was created by William Penn's sons, John and Thomas, about 2 years after this painting was made. Next, please. There's a gorget, which is a neck piece showing this was cast silver, engraved in the mid 18th century, and you see how it was used in that portrait of by Peel of George Washington. And it's sort of rather somewhat revisionist history, because it's it's casting back to the amity between the Lenape and William Penn. And one likes to think that that's complex history, which now I think Philadelphians and others have taken for granted for a long time, but with what's very much subject to discussion today, decolonization, we're sort of re-examining that history. Next, please. Washington is a focus, two very grand portraits of Washington, one of the famous Athenaeum portrait on the right, and Washington's desk in the center. Next, please. Series of objects associated with Franklin, which is a great painting by Peel, showing with a bolt of lightning. And then there's a rather charming music stand, Meissen coffee or spirits keg, and a silver tankard, which was Irish, all owned by Franklin. Next, please. Then, moving out from that, there's a painting by David Bustle Bowser, African-American artist, of John Brown, and also the slave shackles that Brown wore at his death, and a pike, which comes from the Harper's Ferry uprising, after which Brown was arrested, And so there's an enormous amount of, well, enormous, there's a significant amount of material in the collection with which curators and Philadelphians can address America's and Philadelphia's complex and rich past. Next, please. And actually that goes back to something that Aaron Thompson was discussing last night about the creation of the Freedom statue on the Capitol and the importance of addressing this legacy, huge legacy of slavery tied up with the creation of the states. There's a maquette, which is an aluminum, the maquette for City Hall, William Penn, which is in the collection, is just over 2 feet high. That was the first aluminum sculpture made, apparently. And I think that may be it. One more? Oh, no, there's more. So photographs, yes, indeed. Paul Robeson, so large collection of photographs. Paul Robeson, photograph of a man who may be Monday Durant, interpreter for the Muskogee Creek Nation. So an African-American who was interpreting for the Creek Nation, who were originally in southeastern US and were moved to the Midwest, forcibly moved to the Midwest. Next. And the sports material is I'm not immensely knowledgeable about baseball, I'm afraid, but I do know about Mike Schmidt, immensely celebrated player, and this is his uniform, and the collection includes the gloves worn by Joe Frazier when he won the World Championship in 1970. Next, and I think that is it. No, oh gosh, on we go. So here's the warehouse in which the collection is stored, and Drexel staff and students working to evaluate the collection. While in the last several years, last 2 years, two and a half years, Drexel's been undertaking a collection evaluation on behalf of the city of the collection to make sure it's fully understood and to assess the materials within it. And we use, in addition to staff, Drexel graduate students, and it's been an intense experience and a very enriching experience for our students in particular. Next, please. Yes, now, let me say a few words, if I may. So Drexel is a collecting institution, has been since its founding, and there are 7 collections at Drexel. There's a founding collection, the Fox Historic Costume Collection, the Polish Poster Collection. So, a university archive, the Legacy Center of Medical History, particularly Women in Medicine, and of course the Academy of Natural Sciences. So at Ward Kent, if the Orphans Court favors the petition put by the city to transfer ownership, we'll join these other 7 collections. And so we come back to question of collecting. But what I wanted to say in the context of Atwater Kent is a very interesting question raised that came up in the public meetings that were held in 2019 to discuss the transfer of the collection from the city to Drexel. And one of the questions raised was that the Atwater Kent Museum, although it had a board of trustees, was a publicly funded, it was city-owned collection and publicly funded. And as a public institution, the idea that this would transfer into a private institution. Now, as we know, universities in America divide broadly into 2 categories, the public universities and the private universities, as indeed do museums. So we have a corpus of national museums, including the Smithsonian, and then municipal museums, and then the vast majority, which are not-for-profits, and they are in that sense, that American sense, private, which is something quite different from just private ownership that you or I would have ourselves. And so the question was raised, the transfer from the public to the private, and what does that mean? It's sort of behind this was this ethical question, this moral question. Can you transfer things from the public sector, notionally in which the public good is being served unequivocally and without reserve, to a private institution which may have specific agendas, specific foci, and of course they do. So in thinking about this, and let me give the reasons why it would be appropriate for Drexel in particular. I don't want to answer for all private institutions, but why in the case of Drexel and answering, sometimes these ethical questions have to be answered through cases rather than in general. So Drexel has made a point of establishing itself as a university which is
Derek, you've muted yourself inadvertently, or been muted.
Sorry, I'm back. So I'm saying that we have the Lenfest Centre for Cultural Partnerships, the Lindy Centre for Civic Engagement, and these sort of reflect Drexel's approach to civic engagement. And so this public idea, I think the thing that one has to do with collections, and this is whether one's a private institution with its beneficiaries, public institution, there are responsibilities which have to be served. And I think in this case, the responsibilities of the public institution that we need to keep our eye on, which we at Drexel we need to keep in focus, are some fairly obvious ones, but they could be in some people's minds not foregrounded. I think we have to foreground them. Number one is the responsibility for respect, both to the material and thinking about Aaron Thompson's keynote address, to the material, to the communities, to the sort of larger bodies of knowledge, and so respect is absolutely a lodestone at the moment. There's a responsibility for access. And it used to be that it was physical access, which was always slightly problematic because that always involved, there was always a cost of physical access. If you were trying to access something in the Metropolitan Museum, but you lived in Beijing, it was much more expensive than if you lived in Brooklyn. Now, we're in the digital age, we have digital access, and digital access has become extremely important. And then obviously, and this is something we're talking about, there's a responsibility for acknowledging and including questions of equity. We have to pay attention appropriately to reflecting, representing, respecting all the equity issues involved here. So one way that I think the Atwater Kent collection will address this, if it does come to Drexel, is by being lent. It'll become somewhat library-like. The idea is not to have it located, in a central repository, although some of it may be. The idea is much more to see it as a lending collection for Philadelphians, with which Philadelphians can be engaged. So to other institutions, to museums, libraries, schools, cultural associations, whatever institution association has the means to care and secure as appropriate what's being lent. That's the idea. Get it out and make it a collection about Philadelphia history for Philadelphians. So that, I think, is part of the responsibility. So I'm going to stop there because I'm sure some of these issues will be explored I hope, during the discussion. So thank you, Sean.
All right, thank you, Derek. Thank you, Arthur. And thank you, Anne, for three very thought-provoking presentations. So we are going to move into a Q&A session now. We have about 45 minutes for that. There are 160 of you out there, and I'm going to do my best to manage questions that come in through the chat. So feel free to post to the chat, or if you're not too bashful, you can raise your hand, and we will call on you. Maybe I'll sort of kick us off with one question, which is in some ways I think of reframing of Anne's question about sort of what is our responsibility is. And I'm also reflecting on Aaron Thompson's talk last night, and particularly the question that was asked about the role of the IRS, actually. Derek and Arthur both spoke about sort of respect, and I think respect is sort of an important theme, but it's also sort of hard to define in any consistent way. And Anne talked about the importance of having sort of documented policies and procedures. I wonder if you all think that enough work has been done at the highest levels. And by that, I mean, even beyond the silos of professions like museums or libraries, which may have kind of AAM standards or RBMS standards for some ethical collecting. Has enough work been done at the higher levels, even than that, to allow everyone who calls themselves a cultural heritage professional to make good decisions, to be respectful, make respectful decisions. And I ask that because this panel is very deliberately composed of people from various aspects of the cultural heritage sector, and what more maybe needs to be done.
Well, I mean, as somebody who's very, again, you think about the chain of how things go, I speak from the book trade, I think we, or anybody who's acquiring objects or documents directly, I mean, I think, that's in some ways one of the most delicate and sensitive points of linkage, where, again, what I was mentioning, where you have this uneven knowledge about a marketplace or uneven knowledge about how these things might be used or valued by others. And, often the basic assumption is, if somebody's got something for sale and I pay their price, I walk away and my moral obligation to them has been solved because I've given them the cash that they wanted for an object and I've moved it along. And so this is this idea or this fantasy that there is this, washing of any moral responsibility once you've paid somebody's asking price. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to interrogate as a trade and as a profession, in terms of I guess what I say, educating, not making assumptions that everybody has that equal access to knowledge about the marketplace. And if there's an exploitational lever that happens there, there needs to be probably I think much better guidance from the trade association, including my own. And maybe one of the ways in which that can happen is if libraries and museums ask more, I guess, pointed and regular questions of us about where things come from and what is our relationship to the seller of these materials. Is that an ongoing relationship? And in fact, does the seller from whom I may have acquired something, were they the maker, or did they also have some role in a chain of provenance between myself and the institution that may acquire something? So I'd say, yeah, we need more guidance, and some of that guidance can be put into place by when institutions ask regularly, ask for information. And not every seller may be able to give complete information at every juncture, but just making it part of that habit, I think, is as I know it already is, but making it a more pointed part of that habit, I think, is important.
I wonder if I thank you, Arthur. If either of the other panelists want to take a stab at that.
Should I dive in?
Yes, please.
Or Anne, do you want to? I mean, I've just,
Go
can
for
I just respond to Arthur? I mean, one of the two things here. One is, I think, your question about asking questions. I mean, your comment about asking questions is really important, because for too long, I think the profession, and I don't mean just the profession, but individuals within the profession have often not asked the questions that we all should have asked. Or asked in some institutions but not others, asked in some countries but not others. And the mood at the moment is more questions are better, and more questions are better. So asking ourselves questions about all of the things you raised about provenance and all the other things we can talk about, I think, is really important. In other words, not just passing, not saying, oh good, we've got this thing, that's terrific, it's a fantastic object for our collection, let's move on. So asking the questions, some of the uncomfortable questions sometimes, that's number one. The other one, which goes back to this question of respect, which is approaching where you started, Sean, was that we phrase it very often within the context of liberal democracy. So one of the challenges I find is when is to ask myself and to reflect on what happens when people don't respect other people's practices and ideologies, because we're living now in the West in 2021 in what we like to think is a greater culture of respect, but Arthur, you showed the destruction of the photograph of the larger of the two Buddhas at Bamiyan, and it was very clear that the Taliban were very explicit about not respecting the ideologies either of those who were defending it or of Buddhism, which lay behind it, as idolatrous practices. So we have to think that respect is we understand what we mean by respect, but it doesn't mean that we can assume that respect will be held to everyone equally. What happens when you're confronted with bad practices? Are you obligated to respect bad practices? You talk about the book selling world. We don't respect bad practices in the book selling world, but thieves do.
Right.
Thank you, Derek. I might add to your first point that I think documenting those questions and the answers for institutions is especially important too, as I'm sure and several of us know that digging through collection files is they need to be complete and they need to document those questions. Anne, did you want to respond to that question?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'll just add sort of from a different perspective is, I've talked a little bit about the UNESCO Convention and the Pennsylvania Declaration, and neither of these are laws. One's a treaty, one's a resolution. And so if you're talking about sort of from the very highest level, having laws in place to kind of enforce a lot of this is also just very important. And, I think we're not exactly there yet, unfortunately. So then it does require us to do the digging ourselves and ask a lot of these questions, which it's very, very important to be doing.
Arthur.
I just wanted to, I think, echo one of the points that was made in the wonderful talk last night about the IRS, because one of the hats I wear also is as an appraiser, and in USPAP standards being what they are right now, I don't think that that provenance is surfaced enough in the USPAP standard, and maybe it would be something that would behoove the standards board to make some comments there about if an appraiser is looking at objects that without clear provenance, it may be important for the appraiser to note that and to say that yes, this is a cultural heritage object without clear provenance, from a sensitive part of the world that should have zero market value if it were to come to auction ethically and responsibly right now. So we cannot assign it a value as part of the donation. So, there's a pretty clear frame at which that could happen, and it would make sense, because I do think unprovenance objects, are hard to sell these days for good reason. But there are a lot of them out there that, that donors wish to give to institutions to receive massive tax credits. So that's a really practical one.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you. Why don't we shift to the audience? Lynn Farrington has her virtual hand raised, and then we have a question in the chat that will follow. Lynn?
Hi, I have a question for Arthur and a question for Derek. I was wondering, Arthur, about this online resource and whether there were any issues around copyright that had to be dealt with these rare Afghan periodicals, and how that was all negotiated to make that online resource possible. And for Derek, I'm curious about in the move from a public to a private institution, what goes on around deaccessioning and sale of materials, because those are really important things to think about. If you're going to be giving a public asset to a private institution and they have the ability to then get rid of it through sale, what kind of agreements, thoughts about those kinds of things do we need to take into account? Thank you.
Arthur, I wonder if you're going to address the first of those questions, I might also call attention to the question from Sarah in the chat about the digitized materials and the redaction of personally identifying information and shifting political landscapes.
Yeah, I've read that question with interest, and thank you, Sean, for calling it to my attention, and also thank you, Lynn, for the wonderful question about copyright. And this is one of the places where I'm always careful to say that when I acquire an object, and that object has information as a text or an image, being part of it, I transfer possession of an object to somebody new. If there's a clear right to title that has been made evident to me, and I, as a dealer, can help, logistically transfer that to a new owner, and that owner might be an institution. I always make clear to say, you possess the object, but you do not possess the copyright to these materials. And if there are copyright issues that you may wish to explore, I urge you to take it up with university counsel, your own lawyer, or your own accountant before proceeding. And certainly, I'm sure we said that to all of the parties who are involved in the digitization of the materials from Afghanistan. It became part of the Afghan partisan serials collection. And Sarah, your question is very important because yes, metadata does often show names or precise locations of acquisitions for some of these materials. And I know there are steps that are being taken to help protect the identity of some of the people who worked on this. And and it's important to note that when they first worked on this, it was a point of pride and a point of respect to have their names attached to this cultural work, this cultural preservation work. And a decade ago, when that decision was first made, it's obviously a very different circumstance. So again, I applaud the fluidity of these moments of concern, right? Where 10 years ago it was something that of course we were going to put that name there or put those names there because they were important, and it was important to to show that this was not the work of a book selling company based in Boston. This was the work of an international network of people that included local partners, and so that was the key. But now, obviously, we want that information to be less accessible to a general public through internet browsing and internet searching. Although, again, it's hard to erase some of that once it's already out there. So we do our best. And again, it's the current frame is really about getting people out. And I can say again that there is just an extraordinary network of cultural heritage workers at university museums and libraries who are meeting regularly to get an exit strategy, and in a very practical way. This is not just, oh, wouldn't it be great, but it's talking about things like position, housing, healthcare, and even potentially chartered flights if necessary to help some of these individuals leave. So there's a really extraordinary and heartening effort. And again, I hope to be able to report in another forum soon that it will have succeeded.
And the second part of Lynn's question, was it directed at Derek, I think?
So, Lynn, that's a very good question. I think it's a question which has indeed been raised, and it's been very carefully considered in the numerous discussions we've had with the city and the trustees of the Atwater Kent Museum over the last 3 years. And in fact, it was sort of settled, as it were, in 2019. The deaccessioning process is online. It's under, you can find it under the transition plan on the Philadelphia Museum, the Philadelphia History Museum site. So it is in the public. It's been in the public since 2019. But let me just summarize it quickly. The evaluation process that we're undertaking is indeed to consider the collection and try and identify what is truly associated with Philadelphia and the Philadelphia region and has significance, and what doesn't. It's a very large collection, which was, as we know, regarded as the city's attic, and all sorts of material ended up there. Plus the fact that there are many duplicates, for example, at Water Kent, sort of parts, where you might have 24 at Water Kent bulbs. So do you need all of them? So deaccessioning, the premise is that anything which is deemed appropriate for deaccession, which is not directly related to Philadelphia, does not connect to having Philadelphia provenance, is not significant for Philadelphia, and that's a very broad category. The presumption is against deaccessioning, so it really has to be something which is not evidently, provably not connected with Philadelphia. But if once things are identified for deaccessioning, then they'd be offered to Philadelphia region not-for-profits at no cost. Only when all Philadelphia region not-for-profits had turned such things down would consideration be made for sale. And so I think it's and we're dealing with things we're not dealing with things that are going to be of value here. We're going to be dealing with things which are, it's the opposite. Now, having said that, I would say that on the larger question of public to private, the most celebrated case of a public to private transfer in the last 2 decades, or last decade, in fact, is Detroit, which some of you know about, where the city of Detroit actually owned part of the collection of the Detroit Institute of Arts. And when Detroit went bankrupt, made a significant part of the Detroit Institute of Arts collection was going to be sold. And the DIA at the time could do nothing about it because it wasn't owned by them. And it was a very celebrated rescue. And in fact, it was the opposite of what you're proposing, where the anxiety was not about a private institution selling things. It was about a public. It was the municipality selling things to protect pensions in particular. And you come back and think about the broad issue that many of us in the museum world have wrestled with, and libraries too, for forever, about a sort of large interest. Does the public support health over art or health over culture in a crisis? We saw this a little bit with COVID. Does public funding go towards the arts or towards health? So in the case of Detroit, it's does public funding go towards paintings by Titian or pensions of city workers? And you can imagine that a fair number of people would say no, it's actually pensions to city workers. So in the end, there was the grand deal was created, and $800 million of rescue funding was found, and the collection was transferred from the city to the Detroit Institute, which is indeed a private non-profit, independent non-profit, as many art museums and indeed other museums in the country are. So that's an interesting one.
Thank you, Derek. Emma Hart has her hand raised. Emma?
Hi, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I had a question for Anne specifically, and please excuse me if this is a stupid. I don't mean this to be a stupid question, but it might be, because it's 20 years since I worked in collecting and art and thought about these issues. But as you were speaking, I thought it was really interesting when you highlighted the problem of what you do with a donation that has perhaps a dicey provenance. What is the role of the museum in that case? And I thought, well, can't you just buy it and then give it back to the rightful owner, whoever that might be? And I realized that deciding who that might be tricky. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the barriers to taking such a course of action for an institution like the Penn Museum, and why. I'm sure it's impossible. It's way more complicated than that. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about how it is complicated.
Yeah, sure. It's not a dumb question at all. It's, when something's offered for donations specifically, and say it's, outside of the collecting scope. It's very simple to, offer other options to a donor. Say, this doesn't fit within our collection, but you could try this institution, you could try that institution. It's much more complicated when something's being offered and there are issues of provenance. And so in that case, it's generally a case-by-case basis, but, there's the option of saying to this person, putting them in touch with maybe the embassy for this country that the object comes from to see if they can kind of make arrangements to return it to the appropriate country. Or if it's, something that's maybe tribal, saying, maybe offer it to a tribal museum. But there are sort of barriers in place for us to bring it into our collection and then sort of be the connection to then send it elsewhere, just because our sort of policies and procedures for accepting acquisitions are, such that it probably wouldn't make it to the point where we'd actually accession it, and then we'd have to go through the process of deaccessioning it and then transferring it. I guess there is sort of a middle ground opportunity of taking custody of something and then transferring it elsewhere, which I had found sort of one example of us doing this many years ago as I was sort of reviewing some old documentation of, I believe it was a Polynesian necklace of some sort that had human remains as part of it. And it was offered to us for purchase. And instead of purchasing it, we said to the person, like, if you would be willing to just give it to us, we would be happy to coordinate it getting back to its country of origin. And we kind of made that happen. And that was sort of the first time I'd seen an example of us doing that. And it kind of sparked my interest. It's a really interesting opportunity. It would require a lot of work and probably a lot more staff members to be able to kind of do that all the time. But it is a really great idea. Just I think that there are barriers there, just probably financially and practically. Also, we don't really purchase collections regularly. We just don't have the funds to purchase things. So most things are donation based. But it's an incredible idea, honestly. I love that thought. The
you, Anne. And Derek, yes.
I know there are questions waiting, but let me just sort of say to Anne, one of the conundrums that the art museum directors have faced for a long time is the problem of orphaned objects, which is objects that are excluded from acquisition now by AMD, the Art Museum Directors Association guidelines, which is, goes back to the 1970 rule and rolling rules. What do you do with things that you can't acquire? And I don't mean the institution. What does the profession do with objects that can't be acquired, and which may be very, very significant, and they may not have an obvious route back? I mean, again, Erin Thompson gave us the very clear case yesterday with the Nepalese sculpture in particular. But there are many things where origins are not clear, where they're fuzzy. We know that, and you've got all these things which are floating around of real significance, but they can't be acquired by American museums. And so there's a problem, what broadly called the problem of orphaned objects. And so there have been suggestions for whether a national institution could, as it were, become a common repository for orphaned objects. And hasn't gone anywhere, but the idea has been floating around for quite a long time.
Fascinating. Thank you, Derek. We have 3 questions queued up here. We'll start with John Pollock, then go to Kimberly and Mitch. So John.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for these wonderful presentations. And I want to just maybe follow up with a couple things and put several different things out on the table that you can respond to if you like. And I this is actually a bit of a follow-up to Emma's question too. You made a kind of remarkable point, at least to me, working in a library, almost in passing in your remarks, where you said essentially that, you know, a museum, many museums, and a museum like yours has profoundly changed its entire collecting model from, you know, dig it up and take it home in the case of the Penn Museum, to completely donation centered. It's a little different, I suppose, for libraries where we have a model of very much both, at least my library, and I think, you know, many others. But, you know, that's a kind of a profound sort of shift, and I'm sure many museums, of course, do it. This is the way, and I guess I would be curious for more thoughts on your part about, you know, that sea change, which is not new, but the implications of it in an ongoing way in terms of the resources that museums perhaps ought to have, or as a community of collectors plus museums plus libraries. How is that educational process, that kind of realization that the work has to be done by collectors as well as museums in some iterative way? How could we work better as a collective entity, a collective set of professionals to think about that? You know, the collecting matters, and the museum has a role, a vital role in that. So that was one sort of big issue that I thought worth recalling. And maybe for everyone, since this came up in all of your remarks, this also kind of interesting problem question about digital access as a surrogate, digital access as a promise, digital access in the case of Atwater Kent as a substitute, promise, overpromise, acceptable methodology. What are the limitations of what the digital can be and can do? So thank you, everybody.
I'm happy to jump in first. Thanks, John. Yeah, it is quite a transition that I think we've made over the history of the museum, from very, very active collecting to very passive collecting, and kind of just responding to what is being offered to us. And we get donation offers. We get a lot of donation offers. You know, I'm probably fielding one, maybe more than one a week. And so it is this very kind of interesting shift in which filling gaps in the collection becomes kind of an interesting process, as opposed to sort of seeking out specific items. We're kind of responding to what's being offered to us, but trying to figure out, you know, do these things appropriately fill gaps? How will we use them for educational purposes? We have so much material in the collection, and so much of it is in storage as opposed to being on display. So, you know, what else can we bring in? What else can we appropriately steward? I think that's, in addition to the kind of ethics and legality, the other big question we're always asking ourselves is, can we appropriately steward these pieces that are being offered to us? You know, do we have the storage space and the staff to kind of take care of them? And that's got to be a huge consideration, I think, for every institution right now, is can you really take care of the material that's being offered to you? Arthur, Derek, do you have any other thoughts about any of that?
Arthur, please.
Yeah.
I mean, I just was going to say that question of stewardship and physical space resources, I think, is just, you know, one that is clearly one of the great elephants in the room, which is, you know, there is a tremendous amount of objects and documents and data being produced in the world, and the idea that we can perfectly take responsibility for its preservation and playback, or, you know, serving it up in a reading room anywhere, is just, you know, nobody should pretend that that's possible in a perfect way ever. And yeah, I think that does have an impact on it. And digital trace records of things that have happened which may lead us to personal encounters with people where we ask them questions, maybe as good as it gets in some cases, right? I mean, it's just sort of the idea that because we can create records of practically anything these days, it's like, should we, or is every record or is every object something that must be held in a system of recall with public metadata access? Probably not. But there's just so much. It's like searching for something is easier than it's ever been before. So I think some of it is just a network effect.
I just add, I don't think I'm going to talk about the limitations of the digital, because that's another 5 conferences. But I would say that the question, your first question about collectors, this larger collecting world, can collectors change their practices? That's been an issue for a long time, and one of the most effective ways by which one can encourage collectors to change their practices is not to accept things which don't have clear provenance, because a lot of collectors in the past would have just assumed that their fine collections would end up in either museums or libraries, and that's not the case anymore.
Thank you. All right, let's turn to Kimberly. You've had your hand up for a while.
My digital hand.
Digital
Thank you. Thanks for organizing this. Arthur, I had a question about the Afghanis with refugee status who helped with the collection. So how did you find them? Were they paid? And also, how were their specialized knowledges put to use? And did that offer some perhaps future pathways into the kind of work that you do? And that's all under the umbrella of thanking you for signposting capitalism, because we need to do that often.
Thank you for the great question, Kimberly. And yes, well, this is one of those cases where, again, collapsing, kind of, I guess, supply chains and figuring things out. I did this as under the employment of another bookseller, F.A. Burnett Books in Boston, which should take a lion's share of the credit for making this whole endeavor possible. What we did when the materials were back in Boston is that we started searching by word of mouth for potentially graduate students or members of the refugee and immigrant community at that time from Afghanistan and from Uzbekistan. And it was ultimately a Craigslist employment advertisement that led us to an individual who was Hazara, in terms of his ethnic origins, and had fled Afghanistan as a Hazara refugee in the 1990s. And not only was this individual, fluent in English with just really flawless English and German, but had all of the regional languages that we needed to successfully catalog the collection. And we hired him at a competitive market wage for translators. We consulted translators who worked for some of the university presses in Boston about how should this work be compensated. And this was an employment contract, and we worked together. I worked with this individual, to do the cataloging that was necessary. And I'll admit that we didn't do it to LOC standard, as I subsequently found out. We could have been doing even better work with the transliteration tables, if we had really dialed it in. But we did get, I think, really fantastic information, cultural information, and kind of contextual information about these documents, because we involved someone with that firsthand knowledge, regional knowledge, who could not only provide bibliographic data, but also could give us, richly contextualizing notes that, we were able to, again, bring back to the sources of some of this information, and people from whom we'd acquired it in Afghanistan, and kind of interpolate, that information to create, a pretty good catalog description. So that's how it happened. And yes, and I do know, that person, again, who I'm not going to name, just because I know just the whole cultural space around Afghanistan and refugee status, and how life works these days. I don't want to bring people's names up if they're not consulted in advance, but I know that person has continued to do translation work and I'm still in touch with that individual and their family as well. So some of them are in New York and New Jersey.
Thank you. And I actually, I might add that during our panel, an email arrived over the transom to the Penn Libraries listserv announcing that we're posted a 2-year fellowship position for a targeted at the relocated Afghan community. It would be a cataloging position that is paid. So. All right, Mitch, you are next.
Hi, this has been fantastic. It's a great opportunity to hear, especially across the different collecting worlds. And I think that's where my question is, with 2 people from museum backgrounds and one from more on the rare book and manuscript library side. I'd love to hear your take on the sort of boundaries of uniqueness when it comes to collecting and cultural objects. You know, one of the fascinating things I think in a lot of these discussions is the centrality of archaeological museums, archaeologists, and cultural heritage people in these ethical discussions. And I think it's fair to say that archaeological museums and to some extent fine art museums don't engage in the market today in any way like they used to 50 or 60 years ago. That whereas libraries, academic libraries, national libraries spend literally millions of dollars a year in the commercial market to acquire materials, which is radically different, I think. And it's not seen as sort of vaguely disreputable. I think most archaeological museum directors probably would not take meetings with most contemporary antiquities dealers. It's very different in the library world in terms of reputation and just how practice works. And I think some of that has to do with uniqueness of material. And I'd love folks to sort of reflect on that, Arthur, especially with periodicals and how the story would be different if most national libraries had collected these in the 80s or something. And the way these ethics are negotiated around specialness or not specialness, and how you've seen that work across the museum library divide.
Well, I'll just jump in again on I don't want to, just to address directly. Yeah, there were moments in Afghanistan where, while I was there, I was offered unique, manuscript material, and I said, this, shouldn't probably leave Afghanistan, and I don't think I feel qualified to make a decision about what the country, so we turn down those opportunities, and with something like a serial where it was printed in printed and publicly distributed, right? So when somebody publishes something, they make it public, and it's going to go off like a little dandelion seed out into the world and have its pathway into culture and do its work. And whoever acquires it and perhaps collects every issue of it and keeps it is in fact in some ways I think very much its rightful owner. And because it's not the only copy, it feels I feel much more capable of handling a democratic multiple and transporting it from one place to another, to think that stewardship could happen of one set of that democratic multiple in another place versus removing the only set of that material. So yeah, uniqueness, it's all about uniqueness. I would never want to feel that huge weight of responsibility about handling a unique asset and removing it from a context where it was created without consulting a vast network of people far more knowledgeable than myself.
How does that question resonate with our museum colleagues? You tend to be much more focused on uniqueness, I imagine, but.
Derek, do you want? I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, it's the question of uniqueness is even sort of interesting, even just within the Penn Museum, because there's somewhat of a sort of division of the collection there's the archaeological collection, and then there's the kind of ethnographic collection. And while obviously stewardship is the same, when considering, whether to bring material into the collection or thinking about past collecting practices, we kind of divide the collection a bit differently in thinking about those things. Archaeological material, we're thinking about sort of the laws and the laws a little bit differently, whereas ethnographic material, we're kind of thinking about in a different way. So yeah, I mean, it's just sort of, yeah, it's even divided within the institution, I guess, is what I'll say, which is kind of a strange place to think about it.
I'd just add one thought, that the good question, because it raises also the way in which we think about material according to what we call it. So had a very strange conversation a number of years ago with some city officials who thought that the Penn Museum shouldn't be involved in a group of art institutions because it didn't have art, it only had archaeology and anthropology. And this was to do with marketing and actually getting these institutions out. So there was a great advantage to the Penn Museum in being included in this group. And I pointed out that a number of the objects in the Penn Museum would be paralleled in art museums around the world, but because they were labeled archaeology, they were, as it were, circumscribed. So the way what we call things affects the way we treat them.
That's an excellent point. Thank you. We have time, I think, for one more question, and there's one in the chat from Grace Huffman that I think can also be sort of generalized to the two contexts of libraries and museums. She says, to jump off of Kimberly's question, was there ever a discussion or initiative to catalog the materials in the original language as well as English so that access for the communities of origin have that accessibility as well, especially with such a rich source of contextual information as the cataloger? She points out that the finding aid on Stanford site has only the finding aid in English.
Yeah, I think that is a great question. And I think, again, this is one of the wonderful things about working with multiples and different, collections in different contexts, because, I think that in the United States, we will not, we could not ever understand what our role as, basically imperial powers have, what that role has been historically if we didn't have, Afghan sources in Afghan languages to consult. And now we have that, and it's fantastic that there's actually a finding aid in English. So even those scholars in the U.S. who do not have those languages under their command are able to kind of at least look what the resources are and think about how they could work with Afghan language speakers and to basically to get access through translators. But there are a lot of these publications are cataloged in Afghanistan, and I just mentioned one of the repositories, which is the Afghan Center at Kabul University, and there are many other libraries there, so that at least within Afghanistan for Afghan speakers, there is access to I think metadata about these objects. But there are of course now, and there will be more Afghan refugee communities in the United States who might very, very much wish to have informational access in Afghan languages to resources here. So again, this is there's going to be lag time, and these things shift historically with as populations migrate. So so that's a great question and a great horizon to to think about.
So I had said that was the last question, but just as I said that, and AG posted to the chat a question for Derek. Can you see it, Derek? Shall I read it? Or she's seeking clarification on, I guess, your statement that collectors are no longer assuming that objects will be destined for museums. The question of repatriation and one of arguments of safety of objects being considered might also affect the trajectory of the object's future placement, resulting in a recycling of objects continually in private collections.
Yes, I think it's a very good point, and that's behind this concern about the idea of a repository for orphaned objects, that objects of real merit, which one day may indeed find, or provenance for which may indeed turn up in the future, will just endlessly recirculate around the market. So actually to have a responsible organization that can hold them in trust pro tem would be a good idea. But of course, that's a very expensive undertaking. So yeah, Arthur and you, Sean, raised the question of the IRS. So maybe, Marx was right, it comes back to money.
I maybe would add that, at least in my experience in libraries, we rarely really make concerted efforts to do the kind of provenance investigation around orphan objects that we probably should. And I think that's the kind of work that is something we need to be thinking about more. Okay, well, we are at time. So thank you to Anne and Arthur and Derek for a really compelling conversation and a great way to kick off our symposium today. We are going to break for 15 minutes and then we will reconvene at 11 a.m. Eastern to talk about repatriation issues. So thank you very much. And I hope to see our audience in 15 minutes. Bye-bye.